Hello again to those of you who watched our first community research presentation, and hello to anyone who is just tuning in. I'm Marina from Bridge, a MindSport for All, and in this second presentation, I will speak in a bit more detail about the most popular qualitative research method, the research interview, which also happens to be the main way in which we will collect data for our Bridging Schools project. By the end of this brief talk, you will know what a research interview is, why we do interviews in research, and how you can do your own interviews from start to finish. So let's dive in. When we think of an interview, be that a job interview, a media interview, or a research interview, we immediately think of a conversation. However, each of these types of interviews are conducted for different reasons, and the research interview stands out in that it is a guided conversation that has a set structure and a purpose that is designed to extract research data. The research interview is less formal than the job interview and media interview. However, it has its own set of rules that ensure that sufficient and high-quality research data can be collected. The interview is structured by the researcher who guides the conversation, and its purpose is to understand the world from the interviewee's point of view and to grasp the meaning of their experiences. In other words, research interviews are used as a resource for understanding how individuals make sense of their social world and act within it. Researchers choose to do interviews for a number of reasons. The main reason is that interviews enable new ideas or topics to be explored in great detail. In some cases, the interview is also the most appropriate or only appropriate method to use because the topic may be new and emergent, or there may be limited historic or written material about it. In such cases, people's stories are the main source of data that exist on that topic. Interviews are also great to use when you want to find out more about people's inner world, including what they know, what they think, what they believe, and so on. In addition, many people find interviews to be highly enjoyable to carry out, both in the role of a researcher and a research participant. Rather than rely on preset questions in a survey, for example, the researcher can ask and adapt their questions in real time, and rather than fill out a long or complicated survey, the research participant can tell their story in their own way. So we can see how interviews might be seen as both enjoyable and beneficial. Steinar Kvale, who was a famous Norwegian psychologist, once said in relation to doing interviews that knowledge is understood as buried metal and the interviewer is a miner who unearths that valuable metal. The knowledge is waiting in the subject's mind to be discovered. According to Kvale, your interviewee knows something that you don't, and that is what it's like being them. So the interview is invaluable in getting you to learn about and appreciate their knowledge and their experiences. There are broadly three types of interviews that we use in research, and those are the structured interview, the semi-structured interview, and the unstructured interview. The structured interview is standardized and it has a set format and set questions, and you don't change the order or the wording of the questions as you go along. The semi-structured interview still implements some set questions, though it is more flexible, and not only can you change the order and wording of questions as you go along, but you can also ask your interview to clarify, expand, or follow up on the topics raised. The unstructured interview is non-standardized and there are no research questions per se, so you can give your participants some general topics to think and talk about, and they can speak about these topics in whatever way works best for them. The most commonly used interview type, and the one that we are using in our Bridging Schools project, is the semi-structured interview. This type of interview is the workhorse of research because it strikes a balance between the two other types and produces a natural flow of conversation whilst also staying on topic. By now you might be wondering, okay, so how do you do an interview? In a practical sense, the interview procedure has a set of well-established steps and principles that you do before, during, and after the interview. Before the interview, you need to think about three main practical aspects. With whom will you conduct your interviews? Where will you conduct them? And how will you record them? You would need to identify and invite people to take part and schedule them into your diary, as well as think about the venue or room in which you're thinking of having your interview, and make sure that this will be sufficiently quiet, comfortable, convenient, and accessible for your participant to get to. It is also worth preparing and testing your audio recording equipment beforehand and get any supplies you think you will need, such as a backup audio recorder, such as your phone as well, and a notebook for you to write down notes as the interview progresses. Once you have sat down with your participant and you're ready to interview them, there are 4 preparatory steps to remember, which are to introduce yourself and explain the purpose of the interview, request and confirm the consent of the participant for you to conduct and record the interview, ask the interviewee if they have any questions, and start your audio recording. You can have a checklist of these preparatory steps to go through on the day, and that way you can be sure that the correct interview procedure has been followed. Obtaining consent from your participants is very important. In the first stage of obtaining consent, you need to ensure that participants receive detailed information on the research they're participating in so that they can make a voluntary, informed, and rational decision on whether or not they wish to participate in the research. And in the second stage, you need to make sure that all parts of the consent document are completed so that there is a clear written record of their consent to participate. As you're doing the interview, it's all about asking good questions, which is really not as hard as it sounds. You simply follow the golden rule of interviewing, which is to use open questions such as what, where, when, how, and why, and to avoid closed questions that would result in a yes or no answer. It does help to keep in mind as you're doing your questioning that you're not looking for a set answer to your question, and you're rather looking to get your participant to open up and talk to you. And what works quite well in practice is to focus on asking them what they think as opposed to telling them what you think, as that can then lead them to just agree with you, in which case you will not get to hear the full story from their perspective. There are a few types of probes you can use to facilitate the interview. For example, you can ask your participants to elaborate or clarify on something, or to provide a little bit more detail. And there are some examples here that you can use as jumping off points. So if your participant says, I've been playing bridge for a while, you can ask them to tell you more about how long they've been playing bridge, or how they got into playing bridge. Or if they mentioned something before that that you didn't get a chance to ask them about, then you can go back and say, you mentioned that you've been playing bridge for a while. Can you give me more detail on that? These types of questions are very much about tapping into your participants' knowledge and memory, and something that may seem quite obvious to them may not be immediately obvious to you. So you do sometimes need to ask them to give you some more contextual information or a bit more detail. And to make it easier for them to answer, it's best to ask one question at a time and keep the questions relatively brief. Another skill that you will use during the interview is active listening, which is the ability to listen effectively. This will require you to be patient and not interrupt or jump in as your respondent is speaking, and to maintain an interest in what they're saying. Show that you're listening. Give them a nod or paraphrase what they have just said to show that you have heard them. And if you see that they're becoming bored with a particular topic, then you can ask them about something else. There are some behaviors that will make it more difficult to get people talking, and some examples are talking too much yourself or asking random questions at random times that tell your participants that you haven't really been listening. It's also not great if you start interrogating the speaker and asking them lots of questions about a particular topic without letting them finish what they're saying or challenging them. This is all common sense, of course, so if you just put your phone on silent and listen intently, then you will be all good to go. During the interview, you will have the interview guide in front of you, which will be very helpful in getting you thinking about the areas you want to cover and the questions you want to ask. The interview guide is a list of questions to be covered. However, it's called an interview guide because it is there just as a guide and not as gospel. And you are free to reword or reorder the questions as needed. In the semi-structured interview, there is a balance between following the interview guide and coming up with your own interpretations of the questions. And the interview guide is mainly there to ensure that you are asking the same general questions of each person so that their responses can later be compiled and compared. So you do have to follow the interview guide to some extent, but you do not need to follow it 100% of the time. After the interview is done, it is good practice to sit down for a few minutes and think about what went well and what could have been done a bit differently. And this is quite good to do because it helps you refine your approach as you go along. And the next time you do an interview, you can be even better prepared and already know the right questions to ask. As you're reflecting, you can note down which questions produced the best and most detailed answers, and you can think about what surprised you, or what you didn't have a chance to find out, or what you would like to do differently next time. And with that, I'm going to conclude this presentation. Many thanks for listening, and good luck with your interviews.